Sometimes the ghosts of our past refuse to stay buried, no matter how deep we dig the grave. In a world where truth and lies dance together like dust devils in the wind, one woman's desperate cry would shatter 30 years of silence. In the dying town of Redemption Flats, giant cowboy Jeremiah Kane dragged a bound woman behind his horse down Main Street. The townsfolk watched in fear as he pulled the rope tight. This wasn't just any woman. For 3 decades, folks whispered her name in darkness, the traitor who destroyed the Cain family and sparked the bloodiest range war in territory history. Now she was back, and Jeremiah meant to finish what should have been done long ago. But when he raised his hand for final judgment, she screamed something that froze him solid. One buried name that changed everything. What truth could stop a man bent on 30 years of revenge? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 30 years ago, Redemption Flats buzzed with the energy of a town that believed in its own future. Cattle drives thundered through twice a month, filling the saloons with laughter and the general store with silver dollars. The Cain family ranch sprawled across 15,000 acres of the finest grazing land this side of the Rockies, and young Jeremiah Kane stood to inherit it all. Back then, Jeremiah was 22 years old, tall even by frontier standards, but his hands were gentle with the horses, and his voice carried kindness when he spoke to the hired men. His father, William Kane, had built the ranch from nothing, arriving with empty pockets and a heart full of dreams after the war between the states. By 1863, the Kane brand was respected from here to Denver, and William's word was as good as gold throughout the territory. The ranch house itself told the story of their success, 2 stories of solid timber with a wraparound porch that caught the morning sun just right. William had built it with his own hands, adding rooms as prosperity allowed. The kitchen smelled of fresh bread and coffee, and the parlor displayed photographs of prize bulls and family gatherings. This wasn't just a house. It was the physical manifestation of the American dream made real through sweat, determination, and honest dealing. Ruth Calloway had been part of that dream for as long as anyone could remember. She'd arrived in Redemption Flats at age 16, an orphan from back east with nothing but a traveling bag and a head for numbers that impressed even the bank manager. William Kane hired her as his bookkeeper when she was barely 18, trusting her with ledgers that represented his life's work. She had nimble fingers that could make columns of figures dance into perfect order and a memory that could recall every transaction from 3 years past. More than that, Ruth possessed something rare in the rough frontier town: genuine education. She could read Latin, speak passable French, and write in a flowing script that made even routine correspondence look elegant. The worn leather journal she kept became legendary among the ranchers, its pages filled with detailed records that could settle any dispute about cattle counts, feed purchases, or seasonal expenses. When neighboring ranchers had disagreements, they'd often ask Ruth to examine their books and render judgment. Her word was trusted absolutely. But Ruth was more than just a bookkeeper to the Cain family. She became the daughter William never had, the sister Jeremiah cherished, and the steady presence that kept their world running smoothly. She lived in the small room above the ranch office, close enough to be family, but separate enough to maintain proper boundaries. Every Sunday, she joined them for dinner, bringing wildflowers from the meadow and stories from her correspondence with suppliers in distant cities. The relationship between Ruth and Jeremiah grew deeper with each passing season. They were both voracious readers, sharing books ordered from catalogs and discussing philosophy by lamplight. Ruth taught Jeremiah to appreciate poetry, while he showed her the subtle art of reading weather patterns and animal behavior. Their friendship ripened into something more precious, a meeting of minds that promised a future built on mutual respect and genuine affection. When Jeremiah was 21, he began courting Ruth in earnest, bringing her small gifts from his trips to town and asking her father's blessing through letters to relatives back east. Ruth's cheeks would flush pink when he complimented her Sunday dress, and she'd save the choicest portions of her cooking for his plate. The entire town watched their romance bloom with approval, understanding that their union would strengthen both the Cain legacy and Ruth's position in the community. The railroad's arrival changed everything, though none of them could have predicted how completely it would destroy their world. In the spring of 1863, surveyors appeared on the horizon, carrying transits and measuring chains. They represented the Denver and Rio Grande, pushing westward with promises of progress and prosperity. William Kane met with them cordially, as was his nature, offering water for their horses and directions to the best camping spots. Initially, the railroad seemed like a blessing. Faster transportation meant easier access to eastern markets for their cattle, and the construction crews would need beef to feed the workers. William saw opportunity where others saw intrusion, already calculating how many head he could sell to the railroad commissary. Ruth worked late into the evening, updating projections and correspondence with potential buyers in Denver and Colorado Springs. But the railroad's appetite for land proved insatiable. They needed not just a narrow corridor for tracks, but broad swaths for stations, switching yards, and maintenance facilities. Their lawyers arrived with maps that showed proposed routes cutting directly through prime Cain grazing land, and their offers grew more insistent with each passing week. The tension began slowly, like a pot set to simmer over low coals. At first, the railroad representatives were polite, even deferential. They recognized William Kane's standing in the community and approached him as a gentleman and equal. Their initial offers seemed generous, fair market value for the land they needed, plus additional compensation for any inconvenience. William studied their proposals carefully, consulting with Ruth over the financial implications. The numbers looked attractive on paper, but William understood something the railroad men didn't grasp. This land represented more than monetary value. It was legacy, identity, and purpose rolled into one. Every acre held memories of cattle drives, roundups, and quiet evenings, watching the sun set over mountains his grandfather would never see. Ruth served as intermediary between the Cain family and railroad representatives, her diplomatic skills helping maintain cordial relations even as positions hardened. She translated technical legal language into plain speech for William and helped draft counterproposals that might satisfy both parties. Her leather journal filled with notes from meetings, copying correspondence, and calculating alternatives. The railroad men respected Ruth's intelligence and began directing their communications through her. She understood contracts and legal terminology better than most frontier lawyers, and her meticulous record-keeping meant nothing was forgotten or misrepresented. When disagreements arose over survey boundaries or compensation amounts, Ruth's journal provided the definitive record that all parties trusted. As spring turned to summer, the negotiations grew more complex. The railroad's appetite expanded beyond their original requests, and they began pressuring neighboring ranchers to sell as well. They painted visions of a transformed landscape, bustling towns, regular passenger service, and economic opportunities that would make everyone rich. Some ranchers were tempted. Others, like William Kane, remained skeptical. Ruth found herself caught between her loyalty to the Cain family and her recognition that change was inevitable. She could read the railroad's financial statements and understood the enormous capital behind their expansion. This wasn't a small operation that could be negotiated with or discouraged. This was manifest destiny, backed by Eastern money and federal land grants. During those long summer evenings, Ruth and Jeremiah would walk the boundaries of Cain land, discussing their dreams for the future. Jeremiah spoke of expanding the herd, building a larger house, and raising children who would inherit an even greater ranch. Ruth shared his vision, but worried about the forces gathering beyond their control. She'd read enough history to know that progress often trampled individual dreams, no matter how precious they seemed to their dreamers. The community watched these developments with growing unease. Redemption flats had grown around the cattle industry, and the ranches were its foundation. If men like William Kane were forced off their land, what would happen to the town itself? The general store, the blacksmith, the church, and the school all depended on the prosperity that flowed from successful ranching operations. Ruth attended town meetings where heated discussions raged about railroad expansion and its implications. She took careful notes, documenting the arguments and concerns raised by different factions. Some saw the railroad as salvation, a chance to connect their isolated community with the wider world. Others viewed it as invasion, threatening to destroy the very qualities that made their town special. By autumn, the battle lines were drawn. The railroad had acquired options on several smaller properties, creating a patchwork of control that put pressure on holdouts like the Cain family. Their lawyers grew less diplomatic, hinting at eminent domain proceedings and federal intervention. The friendly negotiations gave way to ultimatums backed by legal threats. William Kane refused to buckle under pressure, but the stress took its toll. He aged visibly that fall, his hair turning grey and his shoulders stooping under burdens that seemed to multiply daily. Ruth worried about his health and tried to shield him from the most upsetting correspondence, but there was no escaping the reality that their world was under siege. The first hint of real trouble came in October, when Ruth discovered discrepancies in some of the railroad's paperwork. Survey measurements didn't match official county records, and some of the legal descriptions seemed deliberately vague. She spent hours cross-referencing documents, creating detailed charts that highlighted the inconsistencies. When Ruth presented her findings to William, his face darkened with anger and concern. If the railroad was willing to manipulate surveys and legal descriptions, what other deceptions might they attempt? Ruth's journal became even more important as she documented every interaction, every piece of correspondence, and every meeting with railroad representatives. The situation grew more ominous as winter approached. Strange men appeared in town, not railroad surveyors or legitimate businessmen, but hard-looking characters who asked too many questions and paid for their drinks with gold coins. Ruth noticed them watching the ranch house from distant ridgelines, and Jeremiah began carrying his rifle even on routine errands to town. The leather journal that had once recorded routine business transactions now documented a mounting crisis. Ruth's careful handwriting filled page after page with observations about railroad tactics, legal maneuvers, and the growing tension that gripped their community. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, that they stood at a crossroads where their choices would determine not just their own fate, but the future of everyone they cared about. As 1863 drew to a close, Ruth Calloway sat in her small room above the ranch office, lamplight flickering across the pages of her journal. She was writing what she hoped would be the final entry about railroad negotiations, but something deep in her heart whispered that the real trouble was just beginning. The numbers in her ledgers told a clear story. The Cain family had the resources to fight, but victory would require more than money. It would demand wisdom, courage, and perhaps most importantly, the absolute trust of everyone involved. Ruth closed her journal and prepared for sleep, unaware that within months that trust would be shattered so completely that 30 years wouldn't be enough time to repair the damage. The morning that changed everything began like any other in February of 1864. Ruth arrived at the ranch office before dawn, as was her custom, carrying a steaming cup of coffee and the previous day's mail from town. The leather journal lay open on her desk, ready to record another day's business in her precise handwriting. She had no way of knowing that by sunset, her world would be in ruins, and her name would be cursed throughout the territory. William Kane burst through the office door just after sunrise, his face flushed with rage and his hands trembling as he clutched a rolled document. Behind him, Jeremiah followed with grim determination etched across his features. Ruth had never seen either man look so stricken, and her heart began racing before she understood the cause. "Ruth," William's voice cracked with emotion as he spread the document across her desk, "tell me this isn't your signature." The blood-stained survey map lay before her, its edges torn and stained with what looked like dried blood. But it was the papers attached to it that made Ruth's blood run cold. There, in black ink that looked remarkably like her own careful handwriting, was her signature on a land transfer agreement. According to the document, she had sold the railroad company exclusive grazing rights to 12,000 acres of Cain ranch land for the sum of $5,000. Ruth stared at the signature in horror. The letters matched her handwriting, exactly the same flowing curves, the same careful spacing, even the same small flourish she added to the final G in Callaway. But she had never seen this document before in her life, and she certainly had never signed it. "Papa, I've never," she began, but William cut her off with a gesture that felt like a physical blow. "The railroad men came to see me yesterday evening," William said, his voice hollow with betrayal. "They had this document, Ruth. They said you'd been negotiating with them secretly for months. They said the deal was done, and they were moving cattle crews onto our land within the week." Jeremiah stepped forward, his young face aged by disillusionment. "How could you do this to us, Ruth? We trusted you with everything. You were family to us." The accusation hit Ruth like a physical punch. She reached for the document with shaking hands, studying every detail of the forged signature. Someone had practiced her handwriting with meticulous care, creating a forgery so perfect that even she had to look twice to spot the subtle differences. "This isn't my signature," she whispered, but even as she said it, she could hear how weak the words sounded. "Someone has forged this document. I would never betray your family. You have to believe me." William's eyes filled with tears of rage and disappointment. "The railroad men had witnesses, Ruth. They said you met with them at the hotel in Denver 3 weeks ago. They have receipts for your room, signed in your own hand. They have documentation of every meeting, every negotiation." Ruth's mind raced as she tried to understand how such an elaborate deception could have been constructed. 3 weeks ago, she had indeed traveled to Denver on ranch business, staying at the Palmer House Hotel while meeting with cattle buyers and feed suppliers. Someone had used that legitimate trip as cover for meetings that never happened, creating a paper trail that would damn her in the eyes of everyone she loved. "The money," Jeremiah said quietly, his voice breaking. "They said they already paid you the $5,000. They have a receipt showing you deposited it in the First National Bank of Denver." Ruth felt the walls closing in around her. Someone had orchestrated this deception with frightening precision, anticipating every detail that would make the forgery believable. They had used her own legitimate business activities as camouflage, weaving lies so skillfully around fragments of truth that even she might have believed them if the situation were reversed. "Please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "You've known me for 6 years. Have I ever lied to you? Have I ever done anything to harm this family? Why would I suddenly betray everything I hold dear?" But William's face had hardened into an expression Ruth had never seen before. The kindly patriarch who had treated her like a daughter was gone, replaced by a man who saw treachery where once he had seen love. "Money changes people, Ruth. Maybe $5,000 was enough to make you forget your loyalties." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their confrontation. Through the office window, Ruth could see a group of men riding toward the ranch house. Even at a distance, she recognized the railroad security force, hard men with tied-down guns who were rumored to have experience with range wars in other territories. Leading them was Marcus Cain, William's brother and Jeremiah's uncle. Marcus had always been the family's negotiator, the smooth-talking businessman who handled legal affairs and complex transactions. He swung down from his horse with grim purpose, carrying a leather satchel that undoubtedly contained more damning documents. "William," Marcus called out as he approached the office, "I've just come from town. The railroad's lawyers have filed papers with the territorial court. They claim they have legal ownership of our grazing rights, and they're demanding immediate access to the land. Marcus entered the office and nodded curtly to Ruth before spreading additional documents across her desk. I'm sorry, Ruth, but the evidence is overwhelming. The railroad has documentation of every meeting, every negotiation, every payment. Your signature appears on a dozen different documents. Ruth studied the new papers with growing despair. Someone had created an entire fictional history of secret negotiations, complete with hotel receipts, meeting notes, and correspondence that bore her forged signature. The level of planning required to construct such an elaborate deception suggested resources and connections far beyond what she could fight. Marcus, she pleaded, you've known me since I was 18 years old. Do you really believe I would sell out your family for money? Marcus avoided her eyes as he responded, the evidence speaks for itself, Ruth. I wish it weren't true, but we have to face facts. You've been working with the railroad for months, and now they're using your agreements to steal our land. The sound of gunfire erupted from the direction of the main pasture, followed by shouting voices and the thunder of running cattle. Through the window, Ruth could see smoke rising from what looked like one of the line shacks. The railroad's men weren't waiting for legal proceedings. They were taking the land by force. Jeremiah grabbed his rifle and headed for the door. They're driving off our cattle, he said grimly. Papa, we have to fight them. William Kane looked older than his 53 years as he watched his life's work disappearing in smoke and chaos. Get the men, he told his son. We'll make them pay for every acre they think they're stealing. As the Cain men prepared for war, Ruth realized that her protests of innocence were falling on deaf ears. The forged documents were too convincing, the supposed evidence too overwhelming. Someone had planned this betrayal with diabolical skill, using her trust and position to destroy the family she loved. I'm going to town, she announced, grabbing her coat and the ledger books that might contain evidence of her innocence. I'll find out who's behind this forgery. There has to be someone who can prove these documents are fake. But Marcus blocked her path to the door. I'm afraid you can't leave, Ruth. The territorial marshal is on his way, and he'll want to question you about these transactions. Until this matter is resolved, you'll need to remain here. The implication was clear. She was now a prisoner in the place she had called home for 6 years. Outside, the sounds of battle grew louder as Cain ranch hands engaged the railroad security force in a firefight that would escalate into the bloodiest range war in territorial history. Ruth sank into her chair, clutching her leather journal as if it were a lifeline. Everything in her records contradicted the railroad's claims, but who would believe her word against such seemingly overwhelming evidence? Someone had used her trust and position to engineer the perfect betrayal, and they had covered their tracks with devastating thoroughness. As bullets flew and men died for land that had been stolen through forgery and deception, Ruth Calloway faced the horrible realization that her life, as she knew it, was over. Whether she could prove her innocence or not, the Cain family would never trust her again. The community that had embraced her would now view her as a traitor who had sold out her neighbors for railroad gold. That night, as fires burned across the Cain ranch and the wounded were carried to Dr. Morrison's clinic in town, Ruth made the hardest decision of her life. She could not stay and watch the family she loved destroy itself over her alleged betrayal. She could not remain in a community that would always see her as the woman who started the range war. Under cover of darkness, with gunfire still echoing across the valley, Ruth Calloway packed her few belongings and slipped away from the only home she had known since childhood. Behind her, she left a letter for Jeremiah, a letter that would never be delivered, explaining that she would find the truth and clear her name, no matter how long it took. She did not know that 30 years would pass before she could return to Redemption Flats, or that her quest for truth would end with her bound and dragged through the streets by the man she had once hoped to marry. All she knew was that someone had destroyed her life with surgical precision, and she would spend whatever years remained to her discovering who and why. The range war raged for 6 months, claiming 17 lives and bankrupting half the ranchers in the territory. When it finally ended, the railroad had its land, the Cain family was financially ruined, and Ruth Calloway had become a ghost story that mothers used to frighten disobedient children. But ghosts, as the people of Redemption Flats would eventually learn, sometimes returned to settle unfinished business. 30 years of wandering had carved lines into Ruth Calloway's face that spoke of hardship, determination, and an unquenchable thirst for truth. She returned to Redemption Flats on a Tuesday morning in September of 1894, arriving on the same stagecoach that had carried her away as a broken young woman in 1864. The town she found bore little resemblance to the thriving community she remembered. Where once Main Street had bustled with cattle buyers and traveling merchants, now only a handful of weathered buildings remained open for business. The railroad had indeed come through, but it had brought change rather than prosperity. The tracks ran straight through what had once been the heart of the ranching district, carrying freight and passengers to more important destinations without bothering to stop. Ruth climbed down from the stagecoach with careful dignity, her grey hair pinned beneath a simple black hat and her few possessions contained in a worn carpet bag. She wore the clothes of a woman who had learned to make do with little, clean and mended, but far from fashionable. The tarnished silver locket at her throat was her only jewelry, and she touched it unconsciously as she surveyed the remnants of her former home. The driver unloaded her bag and tipped his hat respectfully. "You got folks here, ma'am. This ain't much of a town for a lady traveling alone." Ruth smiled sadly as she looked down the dusty street toward the skeletal remains of buildings she remembered in their prime. "I have business here," she said simply. "Thank you for your concern." As the stagecoach pulled away in a cloud of dust, Ruth stood alone in the town square, listening to the whistle of wind through broken windows and feeling the weight of 3 decades pressing down on her shoulders. She had spent those years in a dozen different towns, working as a governess, seamstress, and bookkeeper, always saving her money and always searching for evidence that might clear her name. Her first stop was the old boarding house where Mrs. Patterson had once rented rooms to traveling cattlemen. The building still stood, though its paint had long since peeled away and its front porch sagged dangerously. An elderly woman emerged as Ruth approached, studying her visitor with the suspicious eyes of someone who had seen too many disappointments. "We don't take in strangers here," the woman said before Ruth could speak. "Town's got no business to speak of, and folks who come here usually bring trouble with them." Ruth set down her carpetbag and removed her hat, letting her grey hair catch the morning sunlight. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm Ruth Calloway. I lived here 30 years ago." The old woman's eyes widened with recognition and something that might have been fear. "Ruth Calloway," she whispered, "the one who—" She stopped herself, glancing nervously up and down the empty street. "The one who was accused of betraying the Cain family," Ruth finished gently. "Yes, that's me. I've come back to find the truth." Mrs. Patterson's weathered hands twisted in her apron as she struggled with conflicting emotions. Ruth could see the battle playing out in the woman's eyes, the memory of kindness from 30 years ago warring with 3 decades of believing the worst about her former neighbor. "You shouldn't have come back," Mrs. Patterson finally said. "There's nothing here for you now but pain. Most folks who remember those days are dead or gone, and the ones who remain—" She shook her head sadly. "Jeremiah Kane never forgot, Ruth, never forgave." Ruth nodded, having expected this reaction. "I know the risk I'm taking, but I'm an old woman now, Mrs. Patterson, and I can't die with this lie hanging over my name. I need to find evidence of what really happened, and I need people to hear the truth." The boarding house keeper glanced around nervously before stepping closer. "I remember you, child. Remember how you used to bring flowers from the Cain ranch for the dining room table, and how you'd help me with the accounts when traveling men didn't pay their bills." You were never the type to betray anyone. Hope flickered in Ruth's chest at these words. Then you believe I was innocent? Mrs. Patterson sighed deeply. What I believe and what I can prove are different things. But yes, I never believed you'd sell out William Kane. That man treated you like his own daughter. She paused, studying Ruth's aged face. But if you're looking for folks who'll speak up for you, you'll be disappointed. Fear runs deep in this town, and Jeremiah Kane's reputation runs deeper. Ruth picked up her carpet bag and straightened her shoulders. I'll take that room if you have one available. I won't be any trouble, and I can pay in advance. Mrs. Patterson hesitated for a long moment before nodding. Room 3, upstairs. Same one you had when you first came to town, if memory serves. 50 cents a week, meals included, though they ain't much to speak of. As Ruth climbed the familiar stairs, she felt the ghosts of her younger self echoing in every creaking board. This was where she had lived when she first arrived in Redemption Flats, before William Kane had trusted her enough to offer her the room above the ranch office. The tiny space under the eaves felt smaller than she remembered, but it would serve her purposes. She spent the afternoon walking the streets of her former home, cataloguing the changes that 30 years had wrought. The bank building stood empty, its windows boarded over since the financial panic of 1873. The general store remained open but carried only basic supplies for the few remaining residents. Most heartbreaking of all, the schoolhouse sat abandoned, its bell tower home to nesting birds rather than the sound of children's voices. At the far end of Main Street, she found the cemetery where so many familiar names rested beneath weathered headstones. William Kane's grave was easy to spot, an elaborate monument that spoke of a man who had once commanded respect in the community. The inscription read, "Beloved father and rancher, betrayed by those he trusted." Ruth knelt beside the grave, placing her hand on the sun-warmed stone. "I'm sorry, William," she whispered. "Sorry I couldn't prove my innocence before you died. Sorry your last years were poisoned by lies. But I'm here now, and I'm going to find the truth." A shadow fell across the grave, and Ruth looked up to see a man watching her from 20 feet away. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with prematurely grey hair and eyes that held 30 years of accumulated anger. Even aged and weathered, she would have recognized Jeremiah Kane anywhere. "You've got a lot of nerve coming here," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Standing over my father's grave after what you did to him." Ruth rose slowly, her knees protesting after the long stagecoach journey. "Hello, Jeremiah. You look well." "Don't," he said sharply. "Don't pretend we're old friends catching up on pleasant memories. You destroyed my family, Ruth. My father died a broken man because of your betrayal." She could see the young man she had once loved, buried beneath years of bitterness and rage. His hands, which had once been gentle with horses and tender in their stolen moments together, now rested on the butt of a well-worn Colt revolver. This was not the boy who had courted her with wildflowers and poetry, but a man shaped by loss and hardened by the conviction that he had been wronged. "I didn't betray your family," Ruth said quietly. "I was framed, Jeremiah. Someone forged those documents and used my name to cover their own crimes." Jeremiah's laugh was bitter as winter wind. 30 years to come up with that story, and that's the best you can do. You had the money, Ruth. The bank records showed the deposit. You had meetings with railroad officials that half a dozen people witnessed. "All lies," Ruth insisted. "Carefully constructed lies designed to destroy me and your family both. If you'll let me, I can prove it. The only thing you're going to prove is that some mistakes can't be forgiven." Jeremiah stepped closer, and Ruth could smell the whiskey on his breath, not drunk, but drinking steadily enough to dull whatever conscience might remain. "You've got 24 hours to get out of town. After that, I won't be responsible for what happens to you." Ruth met his gaze steadily, seeing the pain beneath the anger. "I'm not leaving, Jeremiah. Not until the truth comes out." I've spent 30 years searching for evidence, and I finally have what I need to prove my innocence. The lie came easily. She had no such evidence yet, but she needed time to find it. Jeremiah's eyes narrowed at her words, and she could see him calculating the implications. "What evidence?" he demanded. Ruth touched the silver locket at her throat, letting him see the gesture. "Documents that prove who really sold your land to the railroad. Names, dates, bank records, everything needed to show that I was nothing but a convenient scapegoat." It was a desperate gamble, claiming to possess proof she didn't have. But Ruth had learned to read men during her 30 years of exile, and she could see that Jeremiah's certainty had developed cracks. Doubt flickered in his eyes before anger reasserted itself. "You're lying," he said, but there was less conviction in his voice. "Give me a week," Ruth said. "1 week to present my evidence to the town. If I can't prove my innocence by then, I'll leave Redemption Flats forever." Jeremiah stared at her for a long moment, his internal struggle playing out across his weathered features. Finally, he nodded curtly. 1 week. But if you're running some kind of game, if you're here to hurt what's left of this town, I'll finish what should have been done 30 years ago. He turned and walked away, leaving Ruth alone with the dead and her own uncertain future. As she watched his broad shoulders disappear around the corner of the church, she wondered if the boy she had loved was gone forever, or if enough of him remained to recognize the truth when she found it. That evening, Ruth sat in her small room above Mrs. Patterson's kitchen, writing in a new journal by lamplight. The original leather journal that had contained her records from the Cain ranch was long lost, probably destroyed, in the violence that followed her flight from town. But she had started a new one during her years of searching, filling its pages with fragments of evidence and half-remembered conversations that might someday lead her to the truth. Tomorrow, she would begin the most important investigation of her life, not just to clear her name, but to give Jeremiah Kane the peace that came with knowing who had really destroyed his family. The silver locket at her throat contained the only photograph she had of their younger selves, a reminder of what love looked like before it was poisoned by lies and betrayal. Ruth closed her journal and prepared for sleep, knowing that somewhere in this dying town lay the evidence that would either vindicate her or seal her doom. The weight of 30 years pressed down on Jeremiah Kane's shoulders as he sat in what remained of his father's ranch house, staring at a bottle of whiskey that had become his most reliable companion. The grand home that had once symbolized the Kane family's success now stood as a monument to their downfall. Rooms, empty of furniture, sold to pay debts, windows boarded against the elements, and silence, where laughter had once echoed through wide hallways. Jeremiah had kept only the main room habitable, furnishing it with the bare necessities of survival rather than comfort. A rough-hewn table, 2 mismatched chairs, and a cot in the corner comprised his entire domestic world. The walls that had once displayed family photographs now held only shadows and nail holes, the images having been sold or burned during the darkest days following the Range War. He poured another measure of whiskey and raised it toward the empty space where his father's portrait had once hung. "Here's to you, Papa," he muttered. "She's back. Ruth Calloway's back, and she's claiming she can prove her innocence." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, and Jeremiah found himself questioning emotions he had thought were settled decades ago. Ruth's return had stirred up feelings he had worked hard to bury, not just anger and betrayal, but traces of the love that had once burned bright between them. Seeing her grey hair and lined face had reminded him that they were both old now, both survivors of a tragedy that had consumed their youth. During the long years since the Range War, Jeremiah had transformed himself from a hopeful young rancher into something harder and more dangerous. The gentle hands that had once bred prize horses now carried permanent calluses from gunfights and barroom brawls. His reputation as a man who never forgot a slight and never forgave a betrayal had spread throughout the territory, making him both feared and respected in equal measure. But reputation came with a price. The community that had once celebrated the Cain family name now treated Jeremiah with wary respect, the kind reserved for rattlesnakes and thunderstorms, dangerous forces to be acknowledged but never fully trusted. Children crossed the street when they saw him coming, and women pulled their skirts aside as if his bitterness might somehow contaminate them. The irony wasn't lost on him that Ruth's alleged betrayal had destroyed not just his family's fortune, but his capacity for normal human connection. He had courted a few women over the years, but none could penetrate the wall of cynicism that surrounded his heart. How could he trust anyone completely when the woman he had loved most had sold him out for railroad gold? Now she sat in Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, claiming to possess evidence that would vindicate her and implicate someone else. Part of Jeremiah wanted to dismiss her claims as the desperate lies of an old woman trying to buy peace before death. But another part, the part that remembered her laugh and the way she had made ordinary moments feel magical, wondered if he had spent 30 years hating the wrong person. The thought was almost too painful to contemplate. If Ruth was innocent, then he had wasted half his life nurturing a grudge against someone who had loved him. Worse, it meant the real betrayer had escaped justice, while an innocent woman suffered in exile. The possibility gnawed at him like a physical wound, making him reach for the whiskey bottle with increasing frequency. A knock at the door interrupted his brooding. Jeremiah opened it to find Doc Morrison standing on the sagging porch, his medical bag in one hand and a concerned expression on his weathered face. Morrison was one of the few people in town who still treated Jeremiah like a human being rather than a dangerous animal to be avoided. "Evening, Jeremiah," the old doctor said. "Mind if I come in? We need to talk." Jeremiah stepped aside, gesturing toward one of the mismatched chairs. Morrison had been present during the Range War, treating wounded men from both sides without regard for their allegiances. His opinion carried weight in the community, and his friendship was one of the few bright spots in Jeremiah's otherwise isolated existence. "I suppose you've heard about Ruth Calloway's return," Morrison said, settling into the offered chair. "Hard to miss," Jeremiah replied, pouring whiskey into 2 glasses. "News like that travels fast in a town this size." Morrison accepted the drink but didn't immediately taste it. "I was there during the war, Jeremiah. Treated men who died believing they were fighting for justice. But I've had 30 years to think about what happened, and some things never sat right with me." Jeremiah felt his defenses rising. Such as why someone with Ruth's intelligence would forge documents so clumsily that they could be easily detected. Such as why she would negotiate secretly when she'd always been forthright in her business dealings. Such as why she would betray a family that treated her like blood kin for money she didn't need. The doctor's words echoed doubts that Jeremiah had suppressed for 3 decades. Ruth had never shown interest in material wealth beyond basic security. She had turned down expensive gifts from suitors, preferring simple tokens that showed thoughtfulness rather than financial extravagance. The woman he had known would have been more likely to give away $5,000 than steal it. "Evidence is evidence," Jeremiah said, but his voice lacked conviction. Morrison leaned forward, his eyes sharp with the intensity that had made him a skilled diagnostician. "Evidence can be manufactured, Jeremiah. We both know that. What concerns me is that you're planning to hurt that woman based on assumptions that might be wrong." "She had her chance to prove her innocence 30 years ago," Jeremiah replied. "She ran instead of fighting. She was a young woman alone, against powerful men with unlimited resources," Morrison countered. "What chance did she have? Who would have believed her word against documented evidence, especially after blood had been spilled?" The questions hung between them like accusations, forcing Jeremiah to confront the possibility that his quest for vengeance was built on false foundations. He had spent so many years nurturing his anger that it had become part of his identity. Without it, who was he? What purpose would drive him forward? "She claims to have evidence now," Jeremiah said finally. "Says she can prove who really sold our land to the railroad." Morrison's eyebrows rose with interest. "Do you believe her?" Jeremiah stared into his whiskey glass, seeing his own reflection distorted in the amber liquid. "I don't know what to believe anymore. Part of me wants to dismiss her claims as lies, but—" He stopped, unable to finish the thought. "But part of you never stopped loving her," Morrison said gently. "Part of you wants to believe she's innocent, because that would mean the woman you planned to marry wasn't capable of betraying you." The truth of those words hit Jeremiah like a physical blow. Despite 30 years of anger and bitterness, despite the evidence and the community's condemnation, some small corner of his heart had never accepted Ruth's guilt. That corner whispered that the woman who had taught him to appreciate poetry and had cried over injured animals wasn't capable of calculated betrayal. "What if she's telling the truth?" Jeremiah asked, voicing his deepest fear. "What if I've spent 30 years hating someone who was innocent?" Morrison reached across the table and gripped Jeremiah's shoulder. "Then you'll have the chance to make things right. But first, you need to give her the opportunity to present her evidence. You owe her that much, and you owe it to yourself to know the truth." After Morrison left, Jeremiah sat alone with his thoughts and his whiskey, contemplating the ruins of his life. The range war had claimed more than cattle, and land it had stolen his youth, his trust, and his capacity for joy. He had become a man defined by grievance, carrying his anger like a badge of honor while the world moved on around him. But now Ruth's return offered the possibility of redemption, not just for her but for himself. If she could prove her innocence, it might free them both from the prison of the past. The question was whether he had the courage to risk believing her, knowing that disappointment might finally break whatever remained of his battered spirit. The next morning, Jeremiah found himself walking past Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, hoping for a glimpse of the woman who had once meant everything to him. He told himself he was merely keeping watch, ensuring she didn't flee town before her week was up. But truthfully, he was trying to reconcile the grey-haired woman he had seen at his father's grave with his memories of the vibrant young bookkeeper who had captured his heart. Ruth appeared on the front porch as if summoned by his thoughts, carrying a cup of coffee and a worn leather satchel. She moved with the careful dignity of someone who had learned to bear hardship without complaint, and Jeremiah felt an unexpected pang of sympathy for whatever struggles had marked her 30 years of exile. Their eyes met across the dusty street, and for a moment time seemed to collapse. He saw not the alleged traitor who had destroyed his family, but the woman who had once made him believe in forever. She raised her hand in a tentative greeting, and after a moment's hesitation, he touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. The gesture was small, almost insignificant, but it represented a crack in the wall of anger that had surrounded his heart for 3 decades. Whether that crack would widen into forgiveness or collapse under the weight of accumulated bitterness remained to be seen. But for the first time in 30 years, Jeremiah Kane allowed himself to consider the possibility that he might have been wrong about the woman he had never stopped loving. Ruth seemed to understand the significance of his gesture. She smiled not with triumph or smugness, but with the sad recognition of 2 people who had lost too much to ever fully reclaim what they once shared. Then she descended the porch steps and walked toward the center of town, carrying her satchel with the careful attention of someone transporting precious cargo. Jeremiah watched her go, fighting the urge to follow and demand to see whatever evidence she claimed to possess. Instead, he forced himself to return to his empty house and his faithful bottle, knowing that the next few days would either restore his faith in human nature or teach him that some wounds could never heal. Either way, the truth was coming, and 30 years of questions would finally have their answers. The ruins of the old church stood at the edge of Redemption Flats, like a broken promise, its steeple collapsed and its windows empty of glass. But it was here, in this forgotten sanctuary, that Ruth Calloway found the first piece of evidence that would begin to unravel 30 years of lies. Hidden beneath loose floorboards, in what had once been the pastor's study, she discovered a collection of items that someone had carefully preserved against time and discovery. The faded church Bible lay wrapped in oiled cloth, its pages yellowed but still legible. Between the chapters of Matthew and Mark, Ruth found pressed flowers, wild flowers, that she had gathered as a young woman and given to Jeremiah during their courtship. Someone had saved them, preserving these tokens of their innocent love like sacred relics from a lost world. But it was the inscription on the Bible's flyleaf that made Ruth's hands tremble as she read the faded ink. In careful script, someone had written, "For the truth will set you free, though it may first break your heart. A friend who remembers." Below the inscription was a list of dates and locations, written in a code that Ruth recognized from her bookkeeping days, a simple cipher that she and Jeremiah had devised for marking private correspondence. The coded message, when deciphered, revealed meeting times and locations where someone had observed secret negotiations between railroad officials and a mysterious figure identified only as the uncle. The final entry was the most damning. March 15th, 1864, 274 in Dod. Uncle received final payment in gold. Document signed with R.C.'s practice signature. The deed is done, and the innocent will pay. Ruth's heart raced as she realized what she had found. Someone had witnessed the conspiracy that destroyed her life, documenting the truth, even as lies spread throughout the community. The dates matched perfectly with the supposed negotiations that had damned her, but they revealed a different story entirely, one where she was the victim rather than the perpetrator. The pressed flowers told an even more personal story. Each bloom was accompanied by a tiny paper label in Jeremiah's youthful handwriting, noting the date and occasion when Ruth had given them to him. First picnic by Miller's Creek, the day she said yes to my proposal, from her hair on our last happy evening. Someone had carefully preserved these memories, creating a shrine to their lost love in the ruins of God's house. As Ruth studied the evidence, she heard footsteps on the broken boards behind her. She turned to find an elderly man watching her from the doorway, bent with age, but still recognizable as Tommy Morrison, Doc Morrison's younger brother, who had served as the church's groundskeeper 3 decades ago. "I wondered when you'd find your way here," Tommy said, his voice crackling with age and emotion. "Been waiting 30 years for someone to look in the right place." Ruth clutched the Bible to her chest, afraid to hope. "You left this here? You know what really happened?" Tommy shuffled forward, his cane tapping against the warped floorboards. "I was young then, maybe 17, but I wasn't blind. Spent most of my time tending the church grounds, which meant I saw things folks thought no one was watching." He gestured toward the hidden cache with a trembling hand. "Saw meetings that weren't supposed to happen. Heard conversations that would have changed everything if the right people had listened." "Why didn't you speak up at the time?" Ruth asked, though she already suspected the answer. Tommy's laugh was bitter as autumn wind. "You think anyone would have believed a half-simple groundskeeper over a respected businessman like Marcus Cain? I tried telling my brother, but he said I was imagining things. Said grief over the range war was making me see conspiracies where none existed." The name hit Ruth like a physical blow. Marcus Cain, Jeremiah's uncle, the family's trusted negotiator, the man who had presented the forged documents as evidence of her betrayal. She had always wondered how someone could have acquired such detailed knowledge of her habits and handwriting, but she had never suspected the answer was so close to home. "Marcus Cain," she whispered. "He was the one who sold the land to the railroad." Tommy nodded gravely, saw him meeting with railroad men at the old line shack near Bitter Creek. This was weeks before anyone knew you were supposedly negotiating with them. Heard him talking about signatures and documents, laughing about how easy it would be to pin everything on someone else. Ruth felt tears streaming down her face as 30 years of anguish finally found its target. Marcus Cain had been like a second father to Jeremiah, the trusted uncle who had helped raise him after his mother's death. The betrayal was deeper than she had imagined, not just theft, but the calculated destruction of an innocent woman to protect a guilty man. I started keeping records after that first meeting, Tommy continued, lowering himself carefully onto a broken pew. Followed him when I could, wrote down what I saw and heard. But when the shooting started and folks began dying, I got scared. Hid everything here and kept my mouth shut, figuring I'd speak up when things calmed down. But they never calmed down, Ruth said, understanding the trap that fear had created. By the time the war ended, you were long gone, and Marcus Cain was the grieving brother helping his nephew rebuild. Who was going to believe that the man comforting the family was the same one who destroyed it? So I kept quiet, and every year that passed made it harder to speak the truth. Ruth opened the Bible again, studying the coded entries with new understanding. You wrote this inscription. You've been the guardian of this evidence all these years. Tommy nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Couldn't bear to destroy it, but couldn't find the courage to use it either. Figured maybe someday someone would need the truth bad enough to look for it. When I heard you'd come back, I knew that day had finally arrived. The old groundskeeper reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather pouch, its contents clinking softly as he handed it to Ruth. There's more. Railroad coins with dates that prove when Marcus received his payments. Letters he thought he'd burned, but I pulled from the church furnace before they were completely destroyed. Everything you need to prove what really happened. Ruth opened the pouch with trembling fingers, her heart racing as she examined its contents. Gold coins stamped with railroad company marks and dated weeks before her supposed negotiations. Partially burned letters in Marcus Cain's handwriting, discussing payment schedules and the need to eliminate the bookkeeper's interference. Most damning of all, a practice sheet where Marcus had repeatedly forged her signature until it matched perfectly. He used you, Tommy said quietly, used your trust and your position to cover his own crimes. When the railroad needed someone to blame for the land grab, he handed them your name on a silver platter. The magnitude of the betrayal was staggering. Marcus Cain hadn't just stolen land and money, he had deliberately destroyed Ruth's life to protect himself. He had watched his own brother's family suffer, had seen Jeremiah transform from a loving young man into a bitter enforcer, and had never shown a moment's remorse for the devastation he had caused. Jeremiah worshipped his uncle, Ruth said, her voice hollow with the weight of revelation. Marcus was the one who convinced him I was guilty, who presented the forged evidence, who counseled revenge when Jeremiah might have chosen mercy. Tommy leaned forward on his cane, his weathered face creased with sympathy. That's the cruelest part of all. Marcus didn't just steal money, he stole his nephew's capacity for love, his ability to trust, his faith in human goodness. Turned that boy into something hard and angry, all to cover his own sins. Ruth carefully returned the evidence to the leather pouch, her mind racing with the implications of what she had discovered. She finally had proof of her innocence, but the truth would destroy whatever remained of Jeremiah's family relationships. Marcus Cain was likely still alive, still respected in the community, still playing the role of grieving patriarch who had lost everything to railroad greed and feminine treachery. What will you do now? Tommy asked, studying her face with concern. Ruth stood slowly, her joints protesting after sitting on the hard church floor. I'm going to tell the truth. All of it, whatever the cost, whatever the consequences. People deserve to know what really happened 30 years ago. As they prepared to leave the ruined church, Tommy grasped Ruth's arm with surprising strength. Be careful, he warned. Marcus Cain has had 30 years to build his reputation and bury his secrets. He won't give up without a fight, and he's got powerful friends who might prefer the old story to the new truth. Ruth nodded, understanding the danger she faced. But 30 years of exile had taught her that some things were worth risking everything to achieve. Justice for herself was important, but healing for Jeremiah was essential. the man she had once loved, deserved to know that his uncle's betrayal ran deeper than anyone had imagined. That evening, Ruth sat in her boarding house room, carefully organizing the evidence that would either vindicate her or get her killed. The pressed flowers from the church Bible lay spread across her small table, like memories made manifest, tangible proof that love had once existed between her and Jeremiah, before lies and betrayal poisoned everything beautiful in their world. Tomorrow, she would begin the most dangerous phase of her quest for truth. She would have to confront Marcus Cain directly, forcing him to account for crimes that had destroyed multiple lives. The confrontation would require all the courage she had accumulated during 30 years of wandering, and the outcome would determine whether justice could finally triumph over carefully constructed lies. As she prepared for sleep, Ruth touched the silver locket at her throat and whispered a prayer for strength. The truth was a powerful weapon, but she would need more than evidence to survive what was coming. She would need the kind of faith that had once filled the church, where Tommy Morrison had preserved the proof of her innocence, faith that right would triumph over wrong, and that love could survive even the deepest betrayal. The daguerreotype photograph felt heavy in Ruth's hands as she examined it by lamplight in her boarding house room. The image was cracked and faded, but the faces were still recognizable, 5 men in expensive suits standing beside a railroad surveyor's transit, their expressions confident with the arrogance of those who believed themselves untouchable. 3 of the men were strangers, but Ruth knew the other 2. Marcus Cain and Judge Harrison Whitfield, the territorial magistrate who had presided over the legal proceedings that followed her flight from town. Tommy Morrison had delivered the photograph earlier that evening, along with a whispered warning that she was being watched. Someone had been asking questions about her activities, inquiring about her visits to the abandoned church and her conversations with longtime residents. The net was tightening around her investigation, but the evidence she had gathered was finally complete enough to present a compelling case for her innocence. The photograph had been taken in March of 1864, according to a notation on the back, just days before the forged documents appeared that implicated Ruth in the land sale. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. This image captured the real conspiracy in action, showing Marcus Cain in direct collaboration with railroad officials, while Ruth was supposedly conducting secret negotiations of her own. A soft knock at her door interrupted Ruth's examination of the evidence. She quickly gathered the documents and photographs, securing them in her leather satchel before approaching the door with careful steps. "Who is it?" she called softly. "Mrs. Patterson," came the whispered reply. "You have a visitor downstairs. Says it's urgent." Ruth's heart raced as she considered the possibilities. Few people in town would call on her openly, and fewer still would do so after dark. She secured her satchel and descended the narrow stairs to find Doc Morrison waiting in the boarding house parlor, his medical bag at his feet and concern etched across his weathered features. "Ruth," he said, rising as she entered, "I'm glad you're safe. There's been talk around town, dangerous talk. Some folks are saying you shouldn't be allowed to stay, that your presence is stirring up old troubles." "What kind of talk?" Ruth asked, settling into the chair across from him. Morrison glanced toward the windows before lowering his voice. "Marcus Cain came to see me this afternoon. Said he'd heard you were spreading lies about the family, trying to rewrite history to serve your own purposes. He seemed agitated, more worried than I've seen him in years." Ruth felt a chill of fear mixed with vindication. If Marcus was concerned enough to begin discrediting her publicly, it meant her investigation was getting close to exposing his crimes. But it also meant she was running out of time before he took more direct action to silence her. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "Nothing that would help him," Morrison replied firmly. "But I'm concerned about your safety, Ruth. Marcus Cain has had 30 years to build relationships and accumulate influence. If he decides you're a threat to his reputation, he has the resources to deal with that threat permanently." Ruth opened her satchel and withdrew the cracked photograph, placing it on the small table between them. Then he's right to be worried. This picture was taken 4 days before I was supposedly meeting with railroad officials. It shows Marcus Cain working directly with the very men who later claimed I had sold out the family. Morrison studied the photograph intently, his expression growing darker as he recognized the implications. This changes everything. If you can prove Marcus was the real traitor, I can, Ruth interrupted, producing additional documents from her satchel. Tommy Morrison has been keeping records for 30 years, documenting meetings he witnessed and conversations he overheard. Combined with the forged signature practice sheets and the railroad payment records, it's enough to prove Marcus Cain orchestrated the entire conspiracy. The doctor leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the revelation. Jeremiah worshipped his uncle. This news will destroy him. The truth often destroys before it heals, Ruth said sadly. But Jeremiah deserves to know that his anger has been misdirected for 30 years. He deserves the chance to forgive himself for hating an innocent woman. Morrison nodded slowly, understanding the deeper implications. What's your plan? You can't simply present this evidence publicly without preparation. Marcus will deny everything, and he has allies who might support his version of events. Ruth had been wrestling with the same question. Public accusations would give Marcus time to prepare counter-arguments and potentially destroy additional evidence. But private confrontation carried its own risks. A desperate man might choose violence over exposure. I need to speak with Jeremiah first, she decided. Show him the evidence privately. Let him absorb the truth before we make it public. He has the right to know before anyone else. And if he doesn't believe you, if 30 years of anger makes him reject evidence that contradicts his deeply held beliefs. The possibility haunted Ruth, but she had no choice except to trust in whatever remained of the man she had once loved. Then I'll present the evidence to the community and accept whatever consequences follow, but I have to try to reach him first. Morrison gathered his medical bag and prepared to leave. Be very careful, Ruth. Marcus Cain has everything to lose if this truth comes out. A man in that position is capable of anything. After the doctor departed, Ruth sat alone in the boarding house parlor, studying the evidence that would either vindicate her or seal her doom. The pressed flowers from the church Bible lay beside the damning photograph, representing the full spectrum of her relationship with the Cain family, from innocent love to devastating betrayal. She thought about Jeremiah as he had been 30 years ago, gentle, idealistic, quick to laugh, and slow to anger. The range war had transformed him into something harder and more dangerous, but surely some trace of his original nature survived beneath the accumulated bitterness. If she could reach that buried part of him, if she could make him see the truth about his uncle's betrayal, perhaps they could both find peace before their time on earth ended. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Mrs. Patterson woke Ruth before dawn with word that Marcus Cain had suffered what appeared to be a heart episode during the night. Doc Morrison was with him now, but the prognosis was uncertain. The timing seemed suspicious just as Ruth's investigation was closing in on the truth. The primary target of her accusations had been conveniently incapacitated. Ruth dressed quickly and made her way through the empty streets toward the Cain family's remaining property. If Marcus was dying, she needed to confront him before he took his secrets to the grave. Justice delayed for 30 years could not be postponed indefinitely, especially if the guilty party was preparing to escape earthly accountability through death. She found the Cain house, surrounded by neighbors and well-wishers, all gathered to offer support during what many believed might be Marcus's final hours. Ruth hesitated at the edge of the crowd, knowing her presence would be unwelcome but determined to fulfill her mission regardless of social conventions. Jeremiah emerged from the house as she approached, his face drawn with exhaustion and worry. When he saw Ruth, his expression hardened into the familiar mask of anger that had defined their interactions since her return. "You've got some nerve coming here," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. My uncle is dying, and you choose now to show your face." Ruth met his gaze steadily, her satchel of evidence clutched tightly in her hands. "I need to speak with you, Jeremiah. Privately. It's about Marcus and what really happened 30 years ago. There's nothing you can tell me about my uncle that I don't already know." Jeremiah replied coldly. "He's the man who helped hold our family together after your betrayal nearly destroyed us." "Please," Ruth said, her voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "Just give me 5 minutes. Let me show you what I've discovered, and then you can decide whether to believe it or not." Something in her tone must have penetrated Jeremiah's defensive anger because he hesitated before responding. The crowd watched with fascination as 30 years of tension played out before their eyes, waiting to see whether old wounds would finally be healed or torn open beyond repair. 5 minutes, Jeremiah said finally, "but if you're here to spread lies about a dying man, I'll make sure it's the last lie you ever tell." Ruth nodded, understanding that she was about to gamble everything on a single conversation. The evidence in her satchel would either free them both from the prison of the past or convince Jeremiah that she was indeed the enemy he had believed her to be for 3 decades. Either way, the truth was finally going to be spoken, and 30 years of carefully constructed lies were about to crumble into dust. The hidden safe stood open like a wound in the wall of Marcus Cain's bedroom, its contents scattered across the faded quilt, where the old man lay gasping for breath. Ruth stared at the documents in shock. Official railroad correspondence bearing Marcus Cain's signature, bank drafts made out in his name, and most damning of all, a leather-bound ledger that detailed every payment he had received for facilitating the land grab that destroyed his own family. "Uncle Marcus," Jeremiah whispered, his voice hollow with disbelief. "These papers, they say you sold our land to the railroad. They say you framed Ruth." Marcus Cain's eyes fluttered open, focusing with difficulty on his nephew's stricken face. The heart episode had left him weak but lucid, and he seemed to understand that his 30-year secret was finally exposed. His lips moved soundlessly for a moment before he managed to speak. "Had to," he wheezed. "Railroad was coming anyway. Would have taken everything through eminent domain. This way, the family got something." Ruth stepped closer to the bed, the cracked photograph trembling in her hands. "You let them destroy my life to cover your crimes. You watched Jeremiah hate me for 30 years, knowing I was innocent." Marcus's gaze shifted to Ruth, and for a moment she saw something that might have been regret flicker in his eyes. "You were young. Thought you'd find another life somewhere else. Didn't know Jeremiah would carry the anger so long. Didn't know?" Jeremiah's voice rose to a shout that brought Doc Morrison hurrying into the room. "You counseled me to hate her. You told me revenge was justice. You fed my anger for 30 years. The safe's contents told the complete story of Marcus Cain's betrayal. Railroad correspondence dating back to 1863 showed him entering into secret negotiations months before Ruth was accused of treachery. The payments had been substantial, not just the $5,000 attributed to Ruth, but ongoing compensation that had allowed Marcus to maintain his lifestyle, even as the family ranch crumbled around them. Most devastating of all was the practice sheet where Marcus had perfected Ruth's signature, copying her handwriting from legitimate ranch documents until he could forge her name flawlessly. The sheet contained dozens of attempts, each one closer to perfect mimicry, accompanied by notes about her writing habits and preferred phrases. "How long?" Jeremiah demanded, holding the practice sheet with shaking hands. "How long were you planning to frame her?" Marcus closed his eyes, exhaustion and guilt finally overwhelming his defenses. From the beginning, Railroad needed a scapegoat, someone the community would believe capable of betrayal. Ruth was perfect, trusted with financial matters, had access to all the documents, close enough to the family to know our vulnerabilities. Doc Morrison moved to check Marcus's pulse, his professional demeanor barely concealing his disgust at what he was hearing. "His heart is failing," he announced quietly. "Whatever you need to know, you'd better ask now." Ruth knelt beside the bed, her anger warring with an unexpected surge of pity for the dying man. "Why me, Marcus? I treated you like family. I trusted you completely." "That's why," Marcus whispered. "Your trust made you the perfect victim. No one would suspect you were being used until it was too late. And your feelings for Jeremiah, those feelings would keep you from exposing the truth, even if you discovered it." The cruel calculation behind his plan was breathtaking. Marcus had understood that Ruth's love for Jeremiah would make her reluctant to destroy the family's faith in their patriarch, even at the cost of her own reputation. He had counted on her compassion and turned it into a weapon against her. Jeremiah sank into a chair beside the bed, the weight of revelation crushing him like a physical burden. "You destroyed everything, our family, our ranch, our future, all for railroad money." "Saved what I could," Marcus protested weakly. "Would have lost everything otherwise. At least this way, some of the family survived." "Survived?" Jeremiah's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Look around you, uncle. Look at what your betrayal created. I'm a broken man, living in the ruins of our home, carrying 30 years of misdirected hatred." Ruth spent 3 decades in exile, branded as a traitor for crimes she didn't commit. What exactly did your betrayal save? Ruth studied the railroad correspondence more carefully, noting dates and signatures that revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. "It wasn't just the land sale," she said, her voice growing stronger with each revelation. "You gave them information about other ranches too. Survey routes, water rights, family financial situations. You sold out the entire community." Marcus's breathing grew more labored as the conversation continued, but his eyes remained alert. Everyone benefited in the end. Railroad brought progress, connected the territory to civilization. Some sacrifice was necessary. "You mean someone else's sacrifice," Ruth corrected. "You made sure the cost was paid by others while you collected the profits." The ledger contained entries that stretched far beyond the original land sale. Marcus had received ongoing payments for information about territorial politics, mining claims, and cattle market conditions. He had essentially served as the railroad's intelligence agent, feeding them data that gave them advantages in every business transaction throughout the region. "The range war," Jeremiah said, understanding dawning in his voice. "You encouraged it. You wanted the fighting to continue because it kept everyone distracted from your real activities." Marcus nodded weakly. "Chaos creates opportunities. While ranchers fought each other, railroad consolidated control. Everyone focused on the war instead of asking hard questions about how it started." Doc Morrison stepped forward, his medical ethics warring with his personal disgust. "Marcus, you need to sign a confession. These people deserve official acknowledgement of your crimes." "Won't matter," Marcus wheezed. "Too late for justice. Too late for anything except regret." Ruth pulled paper and ink from her satchel, setting them on the bedside table. "Sign it anyway. Give Jeremiah something to show the community, something that proves the truth. You owe him that much after destroying his life." Marcus stared at the blank paper for a long moment, his breathing shallow and irregular. Finally, with trembling hands, he picked up the pen and began to write in handwriting that had once been strong enough to forge documents convincingly. "I, Marcus Cain, confess to conspiracy with the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad Company," he wrote slowly. "I sold family land without authorization and framed Ruth Calloway for my crimes. She is innocent of all charges. I alone am responsible for the betrayal that destroyed the Cain family and sparked the range war of 1864. The pen slipped from his fingers as he finished signing the confession, his strength finally exhausted by the effort of acknowledging his guilt. Doc Morrison checked his pulse again and shook his head grimly. "He's going," the doctor announced. "Maybe minutes, maybe hours, but not much longer." Jeremiah leaned closer to his uncle's ear, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you tell me the truth years ago? Why did you let me waste my life hating an innocent woman?" Marcus's eyes focused on his nephew's face one final time. because admitting the truth would have meant losing your respect. Better to be remembered as a grieving brother than exposed as a traitor. Selfish, always selfish. Those were Marcus Cain's last coherent words. His breathing grew more irregular as the minutes passed, and finally stopped altogether as the sun reached its zenith outside the bedroom window. The man who had orchestrated the greatest betrayal in the territory's history died surrounded by the evidence of his crimes, taking with him any hope of fully understanding his motivations. Ruth and Jeremiah sat in stunned silence as Doc Morrison performed the final medical procedures. 30 years of certainty had been shattered in a single morning, leaving them both adrift in a world where everything they believed about the past had been revealed as carefully constructed lies. "I'm sorry," Jeremiah said finally, his voice breaking on the words. "Ruth, I'm so sorry. 30 years of hatred directed at the wrong person. 30 years of calling you a traitor when you were the victim." Ruth reached across the space between them and took his hand, feeling the calluses that 3 decades of hard living had carved into his palm. "We were both victims, Jeremiah. Marcus stole more than land and money. He stole our capacity to trust, our faith in human goodness, our belief that love could conquer all obstacles. Can you forgive me?" he asked, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Can you forgive 30 years of hatred and threats? And there's nothing to forgive," Ruth interrupted gently. "You believed what any reasonable person would have believed based on the evidence you were shown. Marcus was the master manipulator, not you." Outside the bedroom window, word of Marcus Cain's death was already spreading through the community. Soon, the neighbors would learn that their grief was misplaced, that the man they were mourning had been the architect of their town's destruction. The revelation would shatter decades of carefully maintained beliefs and force everyone to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the past. But for now, in the quiet room where truth had finally conquered lies, Ruth and Jeremiah held hands like the young lovers they had once been, beginning the long journey toward healing that would define whatever years remained to them. The gold pocket watch lay heavy in Jeremiah's palm, its engraved surface catching the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the Cain house windows. The inscription read, "M.K. from grateful partners at D.R.G. Railroad, 1864. And the weight of those words seemed to crush whatever remained of his faith in family loyalty. Marcus Cain had carried this token of his betrayal for 30 years, wearing it openly while maintaining the fiction that he was a victim rather than the architect of his family's destruction. Ruth sat beside him on the parlor sofa that had once hosted Sunday dinners and Christmas celebrations, her own emotions a mixture of vindication and sorrow. The truth had set them both free, but freedom came with a price: the complete destruction of Jeremiah's understanding of his own history. Everything he had believed about his family, his uncle, and his own quest for justice had been revealed as elaborate lies built on Marcus's calculated betrayal. "He wore this every day," Jeremiah said, his voice hollow with shock. "Every Sunday at church, every family gathering, every time he counseled me about the importance of family loyalty. He was wearing the railroad's gift while telling me that Ruth had destroyed our name." Doc Morrison entered the parlor carrying a cup of strong coffee and wearing the grim expression of a man who had seen too much suffering in his long career. "The neighbors are starting to ask questions," he reported. "Word is spreading that Marcus had some kind of final confession, and people want to know what he said." Ruth glanced toward the windows, where curious faces could be seen gathering in small groups along the street. The death of Marcus Cain would normally have been a community event worthy of mourning and remembrance, but rumors of scandalous revelations were transforming grief into morbid curiosity. "They have a right to know," Ruth said firmly. "This town has lived with lies for 30 years. The people who lost family members in the Range War, the families who were bankrupted by railroad schemes, they deserve to understand that Marcus Cain was working for the enemy all along." Jeremiah turned the pocket watch over in his hands, studying the craftsmanship that had made it a suitable bribe for a trusted family patriarch. It won't just be Marcus's reputation that suffers. Our entire family name will be destroyed when this comes out. The Cain legacy will be remembered as one of betrayal and greed. The Cain legacy was already destroyed, Ruth pointed out gently. Marcus made sure of that when he sold your land and framed me for his crimes. At least now people will know that your father was an honest man who was betrayed by his own brother. Doc Morrison set down his coffee cup and pulled a chair closer to the sofa. There's something else you need to consider. Judge Whitfield is still alive, still serving on the territorial court. If he was involved in Marcus's conspiracy, and that photograph suggests he was, he won't take kindly to having his own crimes exposed. The implications of that statement sent a chill through Ruth's chest. Judge Harrison Whitfield had presided over the legal proceedings that followed her flight from town, officially certifying the railroad's claims to Cain family land. If he had been part of the conspiracy from the beginning, then the entire legal system had been corrupted to facilitate the land grab. Whitfield has connections throughout the territory, Jeremiah said, understanding the danger they faced. Federal judges, territorial officials, railroad executives, if he decides we're a threat to his reputation, he has the resources to deal with us permanently. Ruth reached into her satchel and withdrew the bundle of evidence they had gathered: Marcus's confession, the railroad correspondence, the forged signature practice sheets, and the damning photograph that showed the conspiracy in action. Then we need to move quickly, present the evidence publicly before they can organize a response. Where? Doc Morrison asked. The courthouse is Whitfield's territory, and most of the other territorial officials are in his pocket. We need a neutral venue where people can hear the truth without interference. Jeremiah stood and walked to the window, studying the growing crowd of neighbors and curiosity seekers. The old church, he said finally. It's neutral ground, and there's enough space for the whole community. We can call a town meeting for tonight, present all the evidence at once. Ruth felt a surge of hope mixed with trepidation. The ruined church, where Tommy Morrison had preserved the evidence of her innocence, would become the stage for her vindication if they could survive long enough to present their case. I'll spread the word, Doc Morrison offered. Tell people there's important information about Marcus's death that affects the whole community. That should draw a crowd without alerting Whitfield's allies about what we're planning. As the doctor prepared to leave, Ruth grasped his arm with urgent intensity. Be careful who you tell. If word reaches the wrong people before tonight, we might not live to see justice done. After Morrison departed, Ruth and Jeremiah spent the afternoon organizing their evidence and preparing for what might be the most important presentation of their lives. The documents needed to be arranged in chronological order, the photographs displayed where everyone could see them clearly, and Marcus's confession read aloud with the gravity it deserved. But preparation was complicated by the steady stream of visitors who came to pay their respects to the deceased. Each neighbor who knocked brought condolences for Marcus's death and subtle questions about his final hours. Ruth and Jeremiah had to maintain the fiction of normal grief while hiding the explosive evidence that would soon rewrite the town's entire understanding of its own history. Mrs. Patterson arrived in mid-afternoon, bringing a pot of stew and the kind of practical sympathy that frontier communities offered in times of loss. But her sharp eyes missed nothing as she surveyed the parlor, noting the scattered papers and the tension that radiated from both Ruth and Jeremiah. Something's not right here, she observed after setting down the food. Marcus Cain was a pillar of this community for 30 years. His death should be bringing people together in mourning, not creating all this whispering and speculation. Jeremiah exchanged a meaningful look with Ruth before responding. There are things about my uncle that the community needs to know, Mrs. Patterson. Things that will be revealed at the town meeting tonight. The boarding house keeper's eyes widened with understanding. This is about Ruth's innocence, isn't it? You've found proof that she was telling the truth all along. More than that, Ruth said quietly. We've found proof of who really betrayed the Cain family and why. The truth is going to shock everyone, but it needs to be told. Mrs. Patterson sank into a chair, the implications washing over her like a cold wave. "Marcus Cain," she whispered. "He was the traitor all along. That's why he was so quick to condemn you, so insistent that you were guilty. He was covering his own crimes." The afternoon wore on with agonizing slowness as Ruth and Jeremiah waited for evening to arrive. Each hour brought new risks. Judge Whitfield might learn of their plans and take preventive action, or Marcus's confederates might decide that silence was preferable to exposure. But they had no choice except to push forward, knowing that this might be their only chance to reveal the truth. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the dying town of Redemption Flats, Ruth felt the weight of 30 years settling on her shoulders. Tonight would either vindicate her completely or result in her death, but either outcome was preferable to living with lies for whatever years remained to her. Jeremiah checked his revolver and secured it in his holster, understanding that the evening might require more than words to ensure justice. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, studying Ruth's determined expression. She touched the silver locket at her throat, drawing strength from the photograph of their younger selves that it contained. "I've been ready for 30 years, she replied. "Tonight, we finally tell the truth, whatever the consequences." As they prepared to leave for the church, Ruth gathered the evidence that would either free them both or seal their doom. The gold pocket watch that had been Marcus's reward for betrayal would become the symbol of his guilt, while his signed confession would speak for him from beyond the grave. The truth was a powerful weapon, but Ruth knew that powerful enemies were gathering in the darkness, preparing to defend lies that had served them well for 3 decades. The next few hours would determine whether justice could triumph over corruption, or whether the innocent would pay once again for crimes they did not commit. Either way, the long night of deception was finally coming to an end in Redemption Flats, and the dawn would bring either vindication or vengeance to those who had suffered in silence for far too long. The loaded Colt 45 felt cold against Jeremiah's hip as he and Ruth approached the ruins of the old church, where flickering lanterns marked the gathering of nearly every surviving resident of Redemption Flats. The weapon had been his father's, carried during the range war that had claimed so many lives, and tonight it might be called upon to defend the truth that had taken 30 years to uncover. Word of the town meeting had spread quickly through the community, drawing curious neighbors from outlying farms and distant homesteads. But Ruth noticed that several faces were missing from the crowd, notably Judge Harrison Whitfield and his closest associates, whose absence suggested they had received advance warning of what was planned. Tommy Morrison stood near the church entrance, his aged frame bent, but his eyes alert with the satisfaction of secrets finally being revealed. He nodded to Ruth as she passed, a gesture that conveyed 3 decades of patience finally rewarded with justice. Behind him, Doc Morrison was setting up a makeshift podium using wooden crates and boards salvaged from the church's interior. "Ladies and gentlemen," Doc Morrison called out as the crowd settled into rough semicircles among the broken pews. "We've gathered tonight because new information has come to light about events that shaped our community 30 years ago, information that changes everything we thought we knew about the range war and its causes." A murmur rippled through the assembled crowd as Ruth stepped forward, carrying the leather satchel that contained Marcus Cain's confession and the evidence of his betrayal. She could see skepticism in many faces. These people had spent 3 decades believing she was a traitor, and changing such deeply held convictions would require overwhelming proof. "My name is Ruth Calloway," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the ruined sanctuary. 30 years ago, I was accused of selling Cain family land to the railroad and sparking the range war that destroyed so many lives. Tonight, I'm here to present evidence that proves my innocence and reveals the identity of the real traitor. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward from the crowd, her face grave with the weight of decades-old secrets. "Before Ruth speaks, I want to say something to this community. I've known this woman since she was 18 years old, and I never believed she was capable of the betrayal she was accused of. The girl who brought flowers to my dining room and helped with my accounts wasn't the type to sell out people she loved for money. Other voices began to join the chorus of support. Old-timers who remembered Ruth's kindness, ranchers who had benefited from her honest bookkeeping, and families who had watched her grow from an orphaned teenager into a trusted member of the community. The tide of opinion was slowly shifting, but Ruth knew that sentiment alone wouldn't be enough to overcome 3 decades of accepted history. Jeremiah stepped beside her, his presence lending weight to her words. "My uncle Marcus Cain died this morning," he announced, his voice heavy with grief and disillusionment. But before he died, he signed a confession that clears Ruth Calloway of all charges and admits to crimes that destroyed our family and our community. He withdrew the handwritten confession from the satchel, holding it high enough for everyone to see Marcus's familiar signature. This document, written in my uncle's own hand, confesses that he conspired with railroad officials to steal family land and frame Ruth Calloway for his crimes. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs and angry exclamations. Marcus Cain had been respected throughout the community, seen as a victim of railroad greed rather than its architect. The suggestion that he had orchestrated the betrayal from within the family seemed almost impossible to accept. "That's impossible," called out Frank Peterson, one of the few remaining ranchers. "Marcus Cain lost as much as anyone in the range war. Why would he destroy his own family's livelihood?" Ruth opened the satchel and withdrew the gold pocket watch, its engraved surface catching the lantern light as she displayed it to the crowd. "Because he was being paid by the railroad for his cooperation. This watch was a gift from the Denver and Rio Grande Company, thanking him for services rendered in 1864. She passed the watch through the crowd, allowing everyone to examine the damning inscription. Faces grew grim as the evidence mounted, and Ruth could see the painful process of belief being overturned by undeniable proof. Tommy Morrison stepped forward, his cane tapping against the broken floorboards. "I can verify what Ruth says. I saw Marcus meeting with railroad officials weeks before Ruth was accused of betrayal. I kept records of what I witnessed, but I was too scared to speak up at the time." The old groundskeeper's testimony carried weight precisely because of his reputation for simple honesty. No one would accuse Tommy Morrison of elaborate fabrication. His straightforward nature made him an ideal witness to complex crimes. Ruth continued presenting evidence: the forged signature practice sheets, the railroad correspondence bearing Marcus's name, the photograph showing him in direct collaboration with company officials. Each piece built upon the others, creating an overwhelming case for Marcus's guilt and her own innocence. But as the evidence mounted, Ruth noticed movement at the edges of the crowd. Men she didn't recognize were positioning themselves near the church entrances, their hands resting near weapons in a way that suggested professional experience with violence. Judge Whitfield might be absent, but his influence was clearly present in the form of hired guns, prepared to silence inconvenient truths. Jeremiah noticed the same threatening presence, his hand moving instinctively toward his father's Colt. "Ruth," he murmured quietly, "we have company. Men at the exits who don't look like concerned neighbors." She nodded slightly, understanding that their window for presenting evidence was closing rapidly. Whatever forces had protected Marcus Cain's secrets for 30 years were preparing to protect them still, even beyond his death. "The most important thing you need to understand," Ruth said, raising her voice to address the entire crowd, "is that Marcus Cain didn't just steal land and money. He stole 30 years of my life, 30 years of Jeremiah's happiness, and the lives of 17 men who died in a war that he orchestrated for personal profit." The crowd fell silent as the full magnitude of the betrayal became clear. This wasn't just about property disputes or business dealings. It was about a man who had sacrificed his own family and community for railroad gold, then watched his victims suffer while maintaining the pose of grieving patriarch. "What do we do now?" asked Dr. Morrison, voicing the question that hung over the entire gathering. How do we seek justice for crimes that were committed 30 years ago by a man who's already dead? Before Ruth could respond, the church doors slammed shut with thunderous finality, trapping the entire community inside the ruined sanctuary. The hired gunmen stepped into the lantern light, their weapons drawn and their intentions unmistakable. "Nobody moves," commanded the apparent leader, a scarred man whose cold eyes suggested extensive experience with intimidation and violence. "Nobody leaves until we decide what to do about these lies being spread against respected community members." Ruth felt Jeremiah tense beside her, his hand now openly gripping his revolver. The evidence of Marcus Cain's guilt lay scattered around the makeshift podium, but it would be worthless if everyone who had heard it was silenced permanently. The final confrontation was beginning, and 30 years of carefully buried truth would either triumph over corruption or be buried forever beneath new layers of violence and deceit. The original deed to Cain Ranch trembled in Ruth's hands as she faced down the scarred gunman who blocked the church entrance. Behind her, the terrified crowd pressed together among the broken pews, understanding that they had become witnesses to crimes that powerful men preferred to keep buried. The deed represented more than property ownership. It was proof of what had been stolen and from whom, the foundation document that gave meaning to all the other evidence. "You don't understand what you're interfering with," Ruth said, her voice steady despite the gun pointed at her chest. "This isn't just about one family's tragedy. Marcus Cain's betrayal affected every person in this room, every family that lost someone in the range war he orchestrated." The gunman's laugh was harsh as grinding metal. "I understand plenty, lady. I understand that Judge Whitfield pays good money to keep certain stories from being told. And I understand that dead people don't spread inconvenient truths." Jeremiah stepped protectively in front of Ruth, his father's Colt now drawn and ready. "You'll have to go through me first, and I've got nothing left to lose, which makes me dangerous in ways you probably don't appreciate." The confrontation balanced on a knife's edge as the two armed men faced each other across the ruined sanctuary. But Ruth knew that firepower alone wouldn't save them. They needed the community's support, and that meant convincing people that the truth was worth fighting for. "Look around you," she called out to the gathered crowd. "See who's trying to silence us. Ask yourselves why Judge Whitfield sent gunmen instead of coming here himself to defend his reputation. What kind of innocent man responds to accusations with violence?" Mrs. Patterson stood up from behind a broken pew, her aged frame radiating righteous anger. "I've lived in this town for 40 years, and I've never seen hired guns used to settle honest disputes. If the judge was innocent, he'd be here defending himself with words, not sending killers to do his talking." Other voices began to join hers as the community found its courage. Frank Peterson, Doc Morrison, and Tommy Morrison all stood despite the obvious danger, their faces set with the determination of people who had endured enough lies and intimidation. "We came here for the truth," Doc Morrison declared, "and we're not leaving without it, no matter what threats you make." The scarred gunman glanced nervously toward his companions, realizing that the situation was spiraling beyond their control. Intimidating individuals was one thing, but facing down an entire community was another matter entirely. Ruth seized the moment to continue presenting her evidence. "The deed shows that Marcus Cain had no legal authority to sell ranch land to the railroad. He forged his brother's signature on the original transfer documents, just like he forged mine on the supposed negotiation records." She held up the deed for everyone to see, pointing to William Cain's authentic signature and comparing it to the obviously forged version on the railroad documents. The handwriting analysis alone proves that Marcus was practicing multiple signatures, perfecting forgeries that would implicate innocent people while covering his own crimes. "Enough!" The gunman raised his weapon toward Ruth, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Judge Whitfield's tired of your lies, and he's authorized me to end this nonsense permanently." Jeremiah's Colt boomed in the confined space, the bullet taking the gunman in the shoulder and spinning him around before he could fire. The man's weapon clattered across the broken floorboards as he fell, clutching his wounded arm and cursing through gritted teeth. "Anyone else want to discuss this with bullets instead of evidence?" Jeremiah asked, training his gun on the remaining hired men. The other gunmen hesitated, realizing that their advantage had evaporated. They faced an armed man who had nothing left to lose and a community that had found its courage. More importantly, they faced the possibility that killing everyone in the church would create more problems than it solved. Ruth stepped forward while the gunmen were distracted, raising her voice to address the entire community. "This is what corruption looks like. This is how powerful men protect their secrets with violence and intimidation. But we outnumber them, and we have the truth on our side." Tommy Morrison hobbled forward on his cane, producing additional documents from his coat pocket. "I've got 30 years of records hidden throughout this town. Letters, meeting notes, payment receipts, everything needed to prove that Judge Whitfield was Marcus Cain's partner in betraying this community." The revelation sent shockwaves through the gathered crowd. Judge Whitfield's involvement elevated the conspiracy from family tragedy to territorial-level corruption. If a sitting judge had participated in the land grab, it meant the entire legal system had been compromised. "Where is Whitfield now?" Frank Peterson demanded. "If he's so confident in his innocence, why isn't he here defending himself?" Ruth smiled grimly as she realized the judge's absence revealed his guilt more clearly than any document. "He's not here because he knows what these records prove. He's probably already fleeing the territory, trying to escape before the full truth comes out." The wounded gunman struggled to his feet, his good hand pressed against his bleeding shoulder. "You people don't know what you're dealing with. Judge Whitfield has connections all the way to Washington. He can destroy this entire town if you push him too far." "He already destroyed this town," Jeremiah replied coldly. "The range war, the failed businesses, the families that fled, all of it traces back to the conspiracy he participated in. We've got nothing left to lose and everything to gain by exposing the truth." Mrs. Patterson stepped closer to the wounded man, her elderly frame radiating surprising authority. "You tell Judge Whitfield that this community has had enough of his corruption. Tell him we're sending copies of all this evidence to the territorial governor, the federal marshal, and every newspaper between here and Denver." The gunman looked around the church, seeing determination instead of fear in the faces that surrounded him. His companions had already begun backing toward a side exit, understanding that their mission had failed and retreat was the only sensible option. "This isn't over," he threatened as he stumbled toward the door. "The judge has resources you can't imagine. He'll find ways to discredit your evidence and destroy anyone who stands against him." Ruth held up Marcus Cain's signed confession, its pages catching the lantern light like a beacon of truth. "Then he'll have to explain why a dying man would confess to crimes he didn't commit. He'll have to account for 30 years of evidence that proves his guilt." As the hired gunmen retreated into the darkness, the community gathered around Ruth and Jeremiah, examining the evidence that had been worth killing to suppress. The documents told a clear story of conspiracy, betrayal, and corruption that reached from the Cain ranch to the territorial courthouse. "What happens now?" Doc Morrison asked as the immediate danger passed. Ruth carefully gathered the precious documents, understanding that they represented more than vindication. They were the foundation for rebuilding a community that had been poisoned by lies. "Now we make sure everyone knows the truth. We send evidence to every authority that might act on it, and we make sure Judge Whitfield faces justice for his crimes." Jeremiah holstered his father's Colt and placed a protective arm around Ruth's shoulders. "And we start rebuilding what was destroyed by 30 years of lies. It won't be easy, and it won't bring back the people who died. But it's a beginning." The crowd began to disperse as dawn approached, carrying with them the knowledge that would transform their understanding of their own history. Ruth and Jeremiah remained in the ruined church, surrounded by the evidence that had finally set them free from the prison of the past. The truth had triumphed, but the victory came with a bitter taste. Too many years had been lost, too many lives destroyed, too much trust shattered to ever fully repair the damage. But for the first time in 30 years, Ruth Calloway could hold her head high in the community that had once branded her a traitor. Justice, like the dawn breaking over the mountains, had finally come to Redemption Flats. The new gravestone stood tall and proud in the Redemption Flats cemetery, its polished granite surface bearing an inscription that finally honored William Kane's memory properly. William Kane, 1870, beloved father and honest rancher, betrayed by those he trusted, but his honor remains untarnished. The stone replaced the bitter monument that had blamed Ruth for crimes she never committed, offering instead a tribute that acknowledged both William's virtue and the family betrayal that destroyed him. Ruth knelt beside the grave in the early morning sunlight, placing a bouquet of wildflowers against the base of the new marker. 6 months had passed since the confrontation in the church, 6 months of testimony, investigations, and the slow process of justice finally taking its course. Judge Harrison Whitfield was now awaiting trial in the territorial prison, his network of corruption exposed and dismantled by the evidence that Ruth and Tommy Morrison had preserved for 3 decades. "I kept my promise, William," Ruth whispered to the grave. "I found the truth and cleared my name. I hope you can rest easier now, knowing that everyone understands you died an honest man." Footsteps approached from behind, and Ruth turned to see Jeremiah walking toward her, carrying a wooden toolbox and wearing clothes that showed the honest dirt of manual labor. The past 6 months had transformed him as much as they had vindicated her. The bitter enforcer was gradually giving way to a man who remembered how to hope and trust again. "The new schoolhouse is almost finished," he reported, settling beside her on the grass. "Should be ready for the first students by September. Mrs. Patterson has agreed to serve as the teacher until we can find someone with proper credentials." Ruth smiled at the news. Rebuilding Redemption Flats had become a community effort, with families who had fled during the dark years slowly returning as word spread that the corruption had been exposed and eliminated. The railroad still ran through their territory, but now it operated under honest contracts that benefited the community rather than exploiting it. "Any word from the territorial governor about compensation for the families who lost property during the Range War?" Ruth asked. Jeremiah nodded, his expression cautiously optimistic. "The territorial attorney says the railroad will have to pay restitution for land that was acquired through fraudulent means. It won't bring back the 17 men who died, but it might help their families rebuild their lives." The process of seeking justice had revealed the full scope of Marcus Cain and Judge Whitfield's conspiracy. Railroad records subpoenaed by federal investigators showed payments totaling more than $50,000 spread over 20 years, far exceeding the simple land grab that had sparked the Range War. The 2 men had essentially sold out the entire territory's interests to corporate buyers, facilitating deals that enriched themselves while impoverishing their neighbors. "I received a letter from Denver yesterday," Ruth said, withdrawing an envelope from her coat pocket. "The territorial newspaper wants to publish a series about the corruption case. They think our story might help other communities recognize and resist similar schemes." Jeremiah took her hand, noting how the months of vindication had softened some of the lines that Exile had carved into her face. "Are you ready for that kind of attention? Having our private tragedy become a public cautionary tale?" Ruth considered the question seriously. The years of hiding and shame were over, but she understood that publicity brought its own challenges. Yet if their suffering could prevent other innocent people from being destroyed by powerful conspiracies, perhaps some meaning could be extracted from the pain. "I think I am," she decided. Too many people have suffered in silence because they believed they were alone against forces too powerful to resist. If our story gives others courage to fight back, then maybe 30 years of exile will have served some purpose. They sat in comfortable silence as the morning sun climbed higher, warming the earth that held so many memories of love and loss. The cemetery had become a place of peace rather than bitterness, its headstones marking lives that were finally being remembered honestly rather than through the lens of Marcus Cain's lies. "There's something I need to ask you," Jeremiah said, his voice carrying the uncertainty of a man who had learned not to take anything for granted. "Something I should have asked 30 years ago, before pride and anger poisoned everything between us." Ruth felt her heart begin to race, understanding the direction of his thoughts. "Jeremiah, I know we're not young anymore," he continued, rushing to get the words out before courage failed him. "I know 30 years of separation can't be erased by simply learning the truth about what happened. But I also know that some feelings survive even the worst betrayals. And I need to know if we... Ruth silenced him by placing her fingers gently against his lips. "Some questions don't need to be asked," she said softly. "Some answers are written in the heart rather than spoken aloud." She reached into her coat pocket and withdrew the silver locket that had hung around her neck for 3 decades, opening it to reveal the faded photograph of their younger selves. 2 faces smiled back at them, across the years innocent, hopeful, and unaware of the trials that lay ahead. "I kept this through everything," she admitted. "Through all the years of believing you hated me, through all the loneliness and doubt, I kept this reminder of what love looked like before the world taught us to be afraid of it." Jeremiah took the locket with trembling hands, studying the faces of the people they had been before Marcus Cain's betrayal, transformed them into strangers. "We can't go back," he said quietly. "We can't reclaim the years that were stolen from us." "No," Ruth agreed, "but we can go forward. We can choose to build something new on the foundation of truth rather than lies. We can decide that love is stronger than betrayal, that trust can be rebuilt even after it's been shattered." Around them, the cemetery held the remains of people who had lived through the Range War and its aftermath, some victims of violence, others casualties of the despair that followed the community's destruction. But their graves also represented the possibility of remembrance, of honoring the dead by ensuring the living learned from their sacrifices. Jeremiah stood and offered Ruth his hand, helping her rise from beside William Cain's grave. "Then let's go forward together," he said, his voice steady with newfound resolve. "Let's spend whatever years remain to us building something worthy of the people we used to be." Ruth took his offered hand, feeling the calluses that years of hard work had carved into his palm. They were both old now, marked by time and trial, but their capacity for love had survived everything that Marcus Cain's conspiracy had thrown against them. As they walked hand in hand toward the town that was slowly rebuilding itself on foundations of truth rather than corruption, Ruth felt a peace that had eluded her for 30 years. The girl who had been branded a traitor was gone forever, but the woman who had emerged from that trial was stronger, wiser, and more determined to live honestly than she had ever been in her youth. Behind them, William Cain's new gravestone caught the morning sunlight, its honest inscription a testament to the power of truth to eventually triumph over even the most carefully constructed lies. The dead could finally rest in peace, and the living could begin the long process of healing wounds that had festered for 3 decades. Redemption Flats was indeed being redeemed, not just its reputation, but its capacity for trust, hope, and the kind of love that refuses to be destroyed by betrayal. The Range War was over at last, won not by bullets or violence, but by the simple courage to tell the truth and let justice take its course. In the distance, the sound of children's laughter echoed from the construction site where the new schoolhouse was taking shape, a promise that the next generation would inherit a community built on honesty rather than deception. The future stretched before them like an unwritten page, ready to be filled with stories worthy of the price that had been paid to secure it.